Okay, so hello. We're going to be talking about safety and risk assessment for the copper cycle. I'm Olber Ramirez.
I'm Andrew Lewistian.
I'm Paul.
I'm Maunuk Manukin.
And I'm Daniel Parker.
Okay, so this is a chemical safety chart for the copper cycle. It basically just lists out hazards, which are very useful when you're conducting an experiment with a copper cycle. And here you have all the chemical formulas listed out, as well as specific hazards that it may have. So one of the segments in that chart was the National Fire Protection Association Hazard Identification System, or the NFPA diamond. It basically was created for hazards, to identify hazards of a chemical during a fire, and it was created to be used by firefighters. And here I have an example for solid copper, the NFPA diamond for solid copper, and has 2 for a health hazard, a 2 for a fire hazard, and a 0 for reactivity. And this white spot is just categorized for specific hazards. And here I have the second part, which was Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, or GHS. And it's basically used to be more specific to the chemical and its hazards. So it's specific in production, handling, and transport, and it utilizes actual sheets of data specific to the chemical, not just these pictograms. But the special thing about GHS is that it can be utilized globally. So it's not just to a specific area by utilizing these pictograms.
All right, thank you, Olber. Now we can put those to use. So chemical hazards are defined as a hazard in the lab caused by exposure to any types of chemicals. These hazards can cause injuries and long-term negative health effects. So in the copper cycle lab specifically, there are a lot of chemical hazards. For example, we have nitric acid, nitrogen dioxide, cupric nitrate, copper-2 nitrate, sodium hydroxide, copper-2 hydroxide, sulfuric acid, copper-2 sulfate, and zinc granules. So if you're ever to get a chemical hazard, if you're getting an irritant on your skin, or if you get anything in your eyes, make sure to tell your TA and follow the proper procedure going through the safety shower and through the eye rinse station. So now we can put the chemical chart, the safety chart that Ulber was telling us about to use. So for example, if we were to see what the chemical hazards are for sodium hydroxide, we would go all the way to the right and look at the GHS hazard, so we can see that sodium hydroxide is corrosive and has acute toxicity. So this would mean that sodium hydroxide, when put on the skin, can be very irritating to the skin and can cause a lot of damage. And acute toxicity would mean that if it's ingested or goes through any sensitive parts of the body, such as the eyes, nose, ears, mouth, any of that, it can be toxic to the body and somewhat poison you. So for these things, if any of this happens, let your TA know and go through the proper procedures to get for safety for that. So the next thing we have are physical hazards. Physical hazards are hazards in the lab that are not chemicals, such as sharp glass, hot materials, hot metal, any of the such. In the copper cycle lab specifically, we have burning yourself on the glass that was heating up by the Bunsen burner, or metals heated up by the Bunsen burner, and the fire from the Bunsen burner itself. Another physical hazard from this lab is cutting yourself on pieces of glass from the broken glassware used around. So if you're to break any of the glassware in the lab, make sure to tell your TA immediately, as for the rest. And so that can be disposed of properly in the broken glass containers, and you guys can get back to doing your lab.
Thank you for that. Hazards associated with the equipment. First is like cutting yourself by the broken glassware, and second is like burned by the Bunsen burners. If you injured by those things, you should tell TA immediately. Next slide, please. The precaution you can take before the lab is that, like, when you're using a Bunsen burner, you could burn yourself if you don't keep your arms away from it. And if the fume hood isn't used, fumes made from a substance could be inhaled. You should be more careful about that.
So as Paul was talking about, one of the most important parts of the lab that you can use to protect yourself is the gloves. Gloves, and more gloves. You should change your gloves regularly between uses. Whenever you handle a chemical, you should put on gloves. Anytime there's a potential for broken glass, you should put on gloves. Hot or cold materials should also require gloves, especially when you're using something that could be corrosive or toxic. Other ways to protect yourself include goggles, lab coats, making sure that you have long pants on, and closed-toed shoes. Another important way to protect yourself is through proper chemical waste disposal. Obviously, there's a very long list of chemicals I'm not going to go through again, but they're all toxic. That we all know. So just make sure that before you're throwing anything away, that it has been properly neutralized and won't present a threat to anybody. And then make sure, like this list shows, to put it in the correct bucket or container to make sure that it can be disposed of safely and properly. And make sure if there's ever any doubt, make sure you reach out to your TA, because they will know and they will be able to help you.
And some other hazards and precautions to think about while in lab is that you should always be aware of your surroundings, and to pay attention to the labels of chemicals to know whether they're toxic or hazardous or whatever they could be. Always be wearing safety goggles and a lab coat. No loose clothing, so like around your ankles or your wrists, they cannot be loose, they have to be tight. If you have long hair, you must tie your hair. You have to cover your ankles and your feet, so you can't wear shorts or anything like that. It has to be long pants, and you have to wear closed-toe shoes, and you cannot wear Crocs. No hanging jewelry, so no earrings, no necklaces, etc. And you cannot wear contact lenses. And that concludes our risk assessment presentation. And thank you for watching.